So do you ever use laser image transfers in your art journal projects? I love using image laser transfers just because it's a great way of adding imagery quite quickly to a project. But sometimes the key to these is figuring out what mixed media layers work underneath it without bleeding or marring that beautiful image that you're going to add on top. So today I'll be sharing with you a really fun mixed media background and how you can add in those laser images with really good success. If we haven't met yet, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So let's get started. So before we get started on the background, I want to talk a little bit about laser prints and how you can go about getting a good, successful laser print for your art journal page. So this is a picture that I took at the Calgary Zoo of a bison. And it was in color originally, and it did not have this much contrast originally. So I went into my photo editing software called ACDC. I added in a little bit more fill light, I added in more contrast, I bumped the saturation and the vibrance, and from there I moved into a software called Luminar 4. So using Luminar 4, which has a ton of different filters and other things you can play with, it's actually quite a brilliant program. You're able to play around with different filters, and then from there even boost it further. So that's why you see a lot of the light areas are super light. This would actually not make a very good picture on its own, but as a laser print that you're going to be adding on to your project, this is going to have enough contrast that's actually going to look good once you add it onto your project. And now the key to this is I'm just going to cut around it, just the general shape. I'm not cutting the whole thing, but I know I'm going to put this on my page, and I need to figure out where it's going to fit on this before I start adding in other layers. So the one thing to realize with any image that you're going to be using is that when you want to add in your laser image, it's going to go in upside down. So if you actually want it in this corner, you would actually need to flip the image in your editing software to get it facing this way. But I don't really care which direction to face, just as long as I had one edge that I could put the bison right up against the edge. And so I think I want to leave a little bit of foreground for him. I think that's where I want it to fall. The reason I'm doing this is I want to start by adding in some embossing resist. And I don't want the embossing resist to really clash with the laser print. And I'm not too sure how they're going to work well together. So to make sure that I get the best image as I can with the laser print, I'm just going to add in the embossing around the image and not in the area where the image is actually going to go. So this is a really easy first step. I'm going to be using white embossing powder, and I have this Topaz clear embossing ink. And I'm going to be starting by adding in some feathers onto my surface. And that stamping box is a little bit small, so I'm just going to move up to the larger one. And so basically I'm just adding in the ink, stamping it on the surface. And this is where you need to be careful with your stamping blocks. I've realized that my stamping block is going across the page a little bit, so I'm not sure how good of a result that I'm going to be getting there. So I did notice that I got more the outside of it, but not a lot of the inside of that image. So I'm going to try this again. I'm actually going to move it to the corner here. So if I'm up against that edge there, that will help me get a better result. And because I'm getting further down in my book, I'm getting closer to the end of this art journal that I made, I'm finding that I'm having a little bit more trouble getting it to be really balanced. Yeah, that's a much better image from where I'm at. So I'm just adding a few of these feathers randomly on the page. I don't need too many of them. I just want a few just to add to this design. And I'll also be moving into a few larger feathers. So now what I want to do is try to add in some white embossing to my images. And this is where I brought in a white piece of paper. And I'm going to add in white embossing powder. And I'm going to have to move my head a little bit and move around it and try to figure out where some of those images are. They can be sometimes hard to see when you're going clear on clear. But the key is to put as much embossing powder down on the surface as possible because you're going to be pushing it all back into a jar. So don't worry too much about making sure it's perfect. And so I have embossing powder on a few spots that I don't want it. So I'm basically just taking a paintbrush and removing off any of those areas where I don't want the embossing. Sometimes you'll make a stamping mistake. Sometimes something will just cling to the surface that you don't want it to. And sometimes just embossing powder will stick to places you don't want it to. And so basically from this piece of paper, I am just going to throw all of this back into my embossing powder container. And that's the thing with embossing powder, it can last you years and years and years because you really don't need much to get a really great result. So now I'm gonna heat emboss these and just set them. So when I was heat embossing this, I made sure that I kept my heat tool moving. You don't want to leave it in one space. You don't want to burn the paper. What you will do is you want to wait for it to turn shiny and it will melt. And so it'll go from gritty to quite clear. You can see all of the feathers that I've added that will go around my bison image. So now we're gonna start adding color. And because of this beautiful inked project that I did earlier this year that I love of my bunny Priscilla, I don't want that to get ruined. So I'm gonna be adding in a silicone mat just to cover that up. I'm also gonna add in a layer of a Chinese rice paper. And what this rice paper do, I think it's called swan paper. I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. I will leave a link to it, but I use it a lot for jelly printing, for making book cloth, for a lot of different things. So I have a big pack of this, but it's also great for absorbing color. So any color that happens to bleed off of this is just gonna go on the edges here. It's gonna catch it, which is also going to protect my image underneath. It isn't always necessary, but I also find it a nice way of starting to create a variety of interesting papers that I can use in collage or another project. So for this next step, I'm gonna be using a variety of Brushos: yellow ochre, lemon, sandstone, vermilion, burnt sienna, terracotta, and rose red. And the reason I'm using all of the warm tones is I do want to keep this to more of a yellow, red, orange feel to this page. And if you've never used brushes before, they're basically a pigmented watercolor powder, and they go on beautifully on pretty much any surface. And if you're feeling a little bit intimidated by your backgrounds, they're a great place to start. I like using them when I'm teaching just because people really love the effect that these give. So I'm starting with a little bit of lemon. I'm gonna throw in a little bit of yellow ochre, and you might notice I have pins in the tops of these. There's so much pigment in there that you actually don't want to take the lids off. It's better to put a pin in them because you're not going to waste as much medium. It's not going to end up everywhere, which is the tendency of this medium. So I've stuck with a little bit more of the yellows to start with. I'm going to add in a little bit of vermilion. That's heading more towards orange. And this might be a lot. I'm trying to keep this area in here quite light. I'm trying to put a little less in there and a little bit more around the feathers themselves. And let's throw in a little bit of terracotta and sandstone. This is probably a lot of color, but I'm trying to have it be a little less water and a little bit more color just off the bat. Again, focusing more on the feathers than the other areas. And so sometimes I add water when I start because I'm trying to keep this a little bit drier, and I am working on watercolor paper, so it will absorb a lot of the water. But because I want to try to keep this lighter, I'm adding in the pigment first and then adding the sprays. And you can add more water to get them to blend more. Or if you like the more textured look, like what I'm doing right now, you can just basically add in just a little bit more of the pigment powder. So I have a little bit more of a mix in there. But now you're starting to see a few of these feathers, you're starting to see them come out from the background because they're going to resist the Brushos. And that's a really fun way of just adding really unique color. So I'm just going to add in a little bit more of the rose red to this corner because I do want the areas where the feathers are to be a bit darker because then you can see the contrast a little bit more. And add in a little bit more of that vermilion. And I add in some lemon because I'm trying to get some of those oranges again, right? Again, yellow and red make orange. So that's where you don't necessarily need to have every color. I still think I want to add in a little bit more color. And because we're adding in a buffalo image, I'm going to add some burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is like one of my favorite kind of reddy brown colors. So we're going to throw a little bit of that in and see how that looks. And I'm doing that with a lot of water because I want it to run off. Because of the fact that I am working with a fairly dark image, I don't want that image to be completely removed. Instead, I want to make sure that I can see a lighter background in behind. And then by just adding in a little bit of yellow, that brightens it a bit. You can mix as much or as little. So we have areas up here where I've done more mixing, areas I've done less mixing. The key to this is deciding how much water you want to add and the look that you're getting. And so in this case, I'm going to try to leave this where it is. The reason being is because you can get more of these galaxy, more textured looks, but the thing is that you can also create more watercolor looks if you're adding more color, or you can have a little bit of blend of both, because I like the texture that the Brushos create. By adding more water in, you end up with a different look, And it's not a bad thing. The question comes down to what are you trying to accomplish? So look at all the colors we've created just with the Brushos. So when we're looking at adding our image, the one thing we need to realize is that we're going to need to put down some sort of gel gloss, gel medium. This is a wet medium. We have a wet, reactive watercolor pigment below. It will be wet if we add the soft gel gloss. So what I'm going to do is take some workable fixative. And if you've never used workable fixative, this is great for pastels. It's great for watercolors. It's great for anything that you want to have a sealed layer, but you want to be able to work on top as well. So if you're ever working with watercolor and you're worried about it bleeding into the layer on top, use a workable fixative. This is a really clever way of being able to add in those additional layers without any trouble. So I'm going to go outside and spray this. I'm probably going to wear a mask, and I will come back in when I'm done and be able to continue moving on. What I'll be actually doing is basically shaking this for 2 minutes. I'll probably have it about 6 inches, maybe a little bit more away from the paper, 6 to 8 inches probably. And I'll spray probably 3 sprays this way, flip it, turn 3 sprays this way, and then let it dry. And then I will come back in and we'll add our next layer. Now the key is we want to decide how much of the buffalo and what part of the background we want to have included. In this case, because we're going to be putting him like so onto the page. And so in this case, I want to maybe rip a little bit along the edge here. I don't want it to have it a perfectly smooth area. But the idea of having a little bit of this black and white areas where he's a bit grounded to the surface, I really don't mind. So I want to make sure that we don't take out his hoof there. And I even don't mind leaving in a little bit of this background area in here. But when we get to here, I kind of want to maybe have a bit of a stronger line. And this is going to be a little bit hard just because he ends up having areas in behind him that are coming through. So with the fur, I'm only going to be able to do so much with it. And I'm okay with that. If you're really particular, you could go in and I could have removed the background too. That would have been the other smart thing to do. But since I didn't, I'm just going to run with it the way it is. Once we add in this laser image, we can make some decisions about what we want to leave in and what we want to take out. Because you're not always going to get a perfect image with a laser transfer, but I wanted to get it close enough. And I think I might actually try to take out that little piece in there with a knife. And so for this, I'm going to be using a soft gel gloss. I like the feeling of this soft gel gloss. It's a little bit thicker than the matte medium, but it isn't so heavy that it's hard to get a good result. And so basically I'm just adding in a layer to the image. I just want to make sure we get a really good solid image to this. And then this is where it gets interesting. So I'm actually going to put some of this on the lid just in case the workable fixative didn't stick as well as I thought. And then this way, at least for sure, we won't get any melding. But no, actually it's going on really, really well. This is the reason you want to use that workable fixative, because look at this. It's going on beautifully. We're not getting any sort of smearing or smudging, where if you had even heat set this and then tried to add this type of stuff in, you would have gotten a lot of bleed and a lot of movement. And now I'm just going to flip it and we want to add it on. And so I think the key to this is go more with the medium than less. If it doesn't have a really good seal, then you're going to run into issues later. About so much gloss medium on here. I'm just going to pull up around some of these areas. So again, if you scrub, you might be picking up a little bit of the color, but generally you shouldn't be picking up much at all. And it'll be cool because you just added it onto that page and it isn't fully dry yet. And before we move on to the next step, we want to make sure this is fully dry. So we're going to take our heat tool and we're going over it. And we want to make sure that it is dry. If it's not fully dry, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for this project. So now we're going to try to reveal our image transfer. You could look to just use a spray bottle to start just dampening the paper, or you could use your finger and some water. It really comes up to whatever you're more comfortable with. The idea with this is that we are trying to keep the laser image, but we're trying to remove the paper. So all we do is we very gently take our finger and we start rubbing. Because that paper is wet, it should lift. And so the idea is you don't want to remove the transfer, you just want to remove the paper. And this will take a few minutes and it will take a few layers. So usually what I try to do is I try to get the first layer of color off, and then I will move to try to get the next layer of color off. And this is why you want to use copy paper, and you want to use less expensive stuff that's a little less thick. It just makes it easier for removing those extra layers of paper. And sometimes I'll dip my hands in the water and And try not to use spray too much because you don't want to get a bunch of these other areas wet. Even though we've used workable fixative, it doesn't mean that it's going to always be perfect for getting a layer. The idea is it's meant to seal in the layer so you can work some more. It's not going to be the same level of sealant as you would get from using a varnish or anything like that. So it's understanding that there are limitations to some of this stuff and keeping that in mind as you work. And this is going to take quite a few minutes just to slowly rub it away. The key to this is patience. If you're not patient with it, you are going to rip your image and it'll probably come off with your paper. Because you could really scrub really hard, and then what's going to happen is it's going to actually pull up the laser print as well. So I'm starting to get a bit closer. And one thing you can do is just, again, add a little bit more water to the surface, or even like don't even add any water to the surface. You can just even rub over top of it and you'll find more paper ends up getting removed from the surface. The key to this is not adding so much water that you end up removing the laser print as well. And so it's a really happy medium about when to stop, because if you go too far, you'll start pulling up your image. You don't go far enough, it's going to look a little bit cloudy. So we've removed a ton of the paper fibers, and I think this looks really great. Considering how dark that image was, I really like how it looks on the page. And so yes, I do have some areas here where I have a little bit of the edge showing through, but I don't mind that because you want to have it a sense like that it's sitting in space. But then you'll notice that there's some areas here that I still have a few white fibers. It's a little bit inconsistent. So how do we have this image look really consistent? You want to start with a little bit of water across the entire image. And what this is going to do is that we're going to wet it down so it gives it that kind of even look that we're looking for. So we want to make sure we get the whole thing, nice even amount of water across the whole surface. So again, we're getting that nice high contrast. It's looking really, really good on the page. Now we want to come up with a little bit of gel gloss. So what we're doing is we're basically brightening it to the point where we like it, and then we're adding in a layer of gel gloss on top. And what this is doing is this is mixing with the water, and this is giving us a more consistent, shiny finish. It's just a way that we can just really even this out, get a really good finish on it, and then keep it to that same bright color that we're looking for. And you don't need to add much. You could even do this with some sort of matte medium, but because I already have this water out, and I find the gloss is really nice too, because it's going to make it look a little bit more vibrant, and with that black and white, a little bit more vibrancy. It doesn't hurt at all, but you should be able to get a pretty even finish on your image. So you might be wondering why I chose to use a bison or buffalo image along with the feathers. And the reason for that is tomorrow is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And over the last few years, there has been a real acknowledgement of the hurt and harm done to the First Nations populations. So the idea of the Canadian holiday for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation is to honor the children who didn't ever return home and the survivors of the residential schools, as well as their families and communities. Because over the last few years, there's been lots of discovery of mass graves, the awareness of the abuse, other travesties that were part of the residential school system. And it really does make my heart hurt for the Indigenous people of Canada. So I find that the more I learn about the hurt, the more I ask myself the question, how can I show the love to these people that are hurting? So a few years ago, when I was contemplating this question, I happened to hear from one of my favorite organizations, Cheer Fund Canada, and they were starting this program called Bringing Back the Buffalo. The idea of this program, it's part of a multi-generational reconciliation process. And the goal of the project is to build sustainable buffalo herds on First Nations land owned by First Nations people. The intent is to help restore cultural identity and provide food for their own people. And before I was part of this program, I really didn't understand just the cultural significance of the buffalo in their society. And what I love about this program is not only because it includes buffalo, and I love buffalo, but also that it is about building relationship. It's about building reconciliation in a way that is truly helpful to these people. Because I feel like sometimes we can focus on what we think is best for another group of people that maybe we don't understand their culture, but instead it's understanding what their need is. It's more than just bringing buffalo back to land. It has a lot more to do with how that affects their culture, how it affects how they view themselves, the pride that they feel from having buffalo back on their land, which were things I never would have thought about until being introduced to this program. I feel that one thing I've learned about the process of reconciliation is learning to ask curious questions, understanding what's important to these people instead of putting my own thoughts and my own biases towards what I think they need. And this is a program that I love, that I'm passionate about, and I thought it might be of interest to you. So I've included in the description below a link to the Bringing Back the Buffalo program. So in honor of Truth and Reconciliation Day, I wanted to do a page about my experience with the Bringing Back the Buffalo program as a reminder for why it's important that we have these moments to recognize this Truth and Reconciliation Day. So I chose an image of a buffalo or a bison to represent the bringing back the buffalo to the First Nations people. I also added in the feathers because my understanding is the eagle is given very high respect in the First Nations. And so I wanted to add in several of these symbols. And I added the orange color because one way in Canada that we show honor and reconciliation is by wearing orange shirts on the day of Truth and Reconciliation. And so that's why I chose the orange color specifically. Even though I generally don't work in orange, I thought it worked really well for this page. So you can see that I've now added in my journaling, and sometimes it's just fun to have in those curving lines. It's a way of just connecting the buffalo to the writing. But I like the idea that the feather was involved and a lot of these parts were in here. And this is where you can come in with a Stabilo all pencil and maybe just add in a little bit of areas of color down here. And because this is water soluble, I'm just going to grab a little flat paintbrush here and I'm just going to blend it in a little bit, make it look a little bit more like the photo. Just by adding in those a few little lines, that makes a big difference on just how it looks and how it kind of connects with everything else on the page. And so this is like a small way that we can just have our image be a tiny bit more grounded. And so the last thing to do is add a little bit of color to the feathers using Beam Paints. And Beam Paints is run by an entrepreneur who's also an Indigenous woman. And that for me is like the perfect relationship. These are not inexpensive paints. What they are is she actually goes and forages all of the ingredients for her paints as she makes them from scratch. I just absolutely love the whole story behind it. And she has these beautiful mica paints. There's a lot of different watercolors that she has. I asked for a small set of these for Christmas because I find that the professional watercolors are not inexpensive, but they are worth every penny that you pay. And the idea that I could be supporting not only a female business owner, but also someone who is First Nations, we can make the choice. We can make the choice to buy the cheapest thing, or we can make the choice to buy something that supports a local business or supports an Indigenous maker. We always have a choice. We have a choice on what we spend our money and our time on. And I feel like money is one of the few ways that we can really have control over things in our world. I feel like I can always vote with my wallet. That's always been something that's been really important to me, that as much as I could be going to large box stores for things, a lot of times I will go find a local vendor just because of the fact that that keeps a local business open. And that's really important to me. And so I'm just adding in a little bit of gold. I really like what I already have going on here, and I don't really want to change it that much. But I thought a little bit of sparkle in these feathers would just add in like just a beautiful final touch to this project. So I hope this is giving you some really great ideas on how you can use laser transfer images in your art journal pages and how you can mix them with other mixed media techniques. And if you have any questions about what I shared today, if you have any comments about this video, just please leave a comment below. I'd love to start a conversation with you. I'd love to know what you think about what I shared today. And so if you've enjoyed this video and you want to see another video about Brushos, click here. This is one I did a little while ago that I thought you'd really enjoy. So I'll see you in the next video.